Gosh, very fun, aggressive message. Yeah, so hi. So I was the undergraduate academic officer at Durham SU for the entirety of last year. And I think I was one of the first people, or at least one of the first people in the time that I was at Durham that held a sabbatical position um, that wasn't white. So I'm mixed race for clarity, which is nice because this year there are now two incredible women of colour that are sabs at Durham. But before that, I was like the first person that I knew of that had held a role like that, which was quite a weird situation. And yeah, kosher. I agree. Yeah. So I was the first person that had held a situation like that, and I'd also had like quite a difficult time as a student, just generally being from multiple minority backgrounds and going to Durham University is not always the most nice experience for any one human being. So I decided that one of my priorities as a SAB was going to be decolonising Durham, launching decolonising resources, and restarting a decolonise campaign. Because basically what had happened previously is there was a decolonise campaign set up by the Durham People of Colour Association about 2 or 3 years ago now, and it had a few like localised working groups, but it didn't tend to gain much traction. I think very much like it was a victim of often like the normal issues of student activism. There wasn't a sustainable continuation of it. It was very much dependent on the people involved. And so one of the things that I was keen to do was to make sure that like there was like a solid basis and the solid groundwork for things to go forward from, and to make sure that like the work would continue post me being in the role. So that's sort of what I wanted to chat about, was like how that process of laying down the groundwork and making sure that like the work going forward is sustainable, but also like has like stays true to like core principles, and like really is able to be like consistent. Oh, Sam would go quiet every few minutes. Okay, that's interesting. I'm unsure as to why that is.
You've been totally clear with me.
Oh, okay.
I think sorry, that might be just a Penny problem.
Sorry, Penny. But yeah, so when I decided to, talking about laying the groundwork, when I decided it was going to be a priority, one of the things I was really keen to do was to make sure it was sustainable, but also to safeguard against the co-option that I knew was like possible from like university execs. Like we, at the start of the year, whenever I had conversations about decolonisation with like university executives, it was very much like, that's just like another word for diversity. That's, it's just like another generic good thing that we need to do. I particularly remember somebody telling me that decolonisation wouldn't fly at Durham because of the class dynamics with the local area. And I was like, well, you can do two things at once. You can care about class and also care about the fact that this is a deeply colonial institution. So it was like quite, initially it wasn't so much as pushback as it was just genuine, at least on university executive side, genuine misunderstanding. And at times that was deliberate, and at times that was as a result of naivety on their part about the scale of the work that needed to happen. So I remember distinctly one time explaining to a white member of staff, a member of the university, about one of my priorities being about decolonising. And they said that one of the things that they were really keen to do was to do a lecture about a person of colour, like just give a lecture about a person of colour. I very distinctly remember being in that space and being like, okay, so anyway, and I think that there was a lot of times throughout the year, I think sabbaticals is fine as any, like generally, but specifically when it comes to topics like decolonizing, like the amount of like, okay, so I'm just gonna park that over there. And so a degree of it was navigating against that and managing expectations of what people actually believed was important and was those things. So getting people to have those difficult conversations about power dynamics and history, which we very much hadn't particularly had in Durham before. So when we were doing the research for the basis of the campaign, we did just like a preliminary look over all of the like Durham's history on like Wikipedia, because obviously there are really famous examples of like in Oxford and Cambridge have like very clear links to colonialism, and the same with like places like Bristol. But I think in places like Durham, it's very much seen as like an over there problem. Like it's not really something they've engaged in, but obviously through the nature of being a higher education institution that was founded when it was founded and being quite elite, it fundamentally has always had those links with colonial practice, right? So part of that was trying to communicate that as well. So the way we basically decided was the best mechanism to ensure that we had that sort of solid basis and that shared understanding was we decided we were going to create a manifesto. So the manifesto basically worked to outline what we meant by decolonization, why we cared about it, and then like some principles. And I think that it was really important to do that, especially in a place like Durham, because Durham isn't a particularly diverse university. It's definitely getting better, but like Durham's access participation plan is on the under recruitment of BAME home students is very much like they want to recruit 25 more Black students every year, which is quite a like tangibly not a very large number, but that's where they're starting from. And I think that it was important then to justify why we thought this work was important, because some people said, oh, like it won't, like class is more of an issue at Durham than race is, and that was a rhetoric that came up quite a lot during the process of setting up the campaign, starting the campaign, was that idea that, well, we need to care about this thing more. This thing's the important thing. Like race, we can wait till later. When obviously, firstly, the two issues are not separate in the slightest, but also it was used by people, particularly middle class people, to deliberately blur and make the conversation significantly harder than it had to be. So yeah, exactly. Like those two things are so very tied up. But I think in a place like Durham, because of the way university executives or the university as a whole would justify why they didn't have particularly high students from low participation backgrounds, why they didn't have particularly high numbers of BAME students, would always be they'd always conflate the two and play the two off against each other. So it was very, very often as a SAB that you'd come into conversations about, oh, well, the reason why we don't have many BAME students at Durham is because we're in the Northeast, but which, when compared to other comparable universities in the Northeast, so like Newcastle, Northumbria, York, Leeds, all have significantly higher BAME like students of color, and it's the same in it's the same for staff. Like there are significantly less. There are half as many BAME members of staff in Durham than there are compared to the Russell Group average. So it's a very white place, but that was used to minimize the amount of work that needed to be done. And it was used at the start cynically by university executives to justify why they weren't recruiting BAME students, because they were told that no, BAME students just don't want to come to the Northeast. There aren't that many BAME students about in the Northeast, which it's not true that there are no people of color in the Northeast, but also it was very much used to silence those voices. And that, as the year went on, we were able to make that smaller and make that go away. But a large part of why we were able to start those conversations, or why we were able to get rid of that narrative, was because racism in Durham over the year really hit a peak. And so it became an issue of not being able to, it was no longer able to be ignored, which is a really bleak reason for why people started to sit up and listen to the things that other people of color were saying. So that was really important. And we also wanted to, I said throughout my year that I think a lot of Durham students are very much, not that they're necessarily all ready and waiting to actually fight for social justice. But a fair amount of Durham students, based on the conversations that I had when I ran for a SAB, but also conversations that I had throughout my degree, was like a fair amount of Durham students were a bit like something is wrong here. You can only be taught John Stuart Mill so many times before you start to think maybe there's an issue with your curriculum. So it was really important in laying that groundwork to figure out how we can tap into those existing conversations. So when it was the case that people are like, I am tired of learning about the same things over and over again, figuring out how we can talk to them and bring them on board and give them some better tools to describe their experiences, because a lot of students were just, at a micro level, to some extent, a fair few students would just dismiss it as like a bad lecturer or whatever, as opposed to the systemic problem that it really was. So we very much wanted to provide students with the language and the tools that they needed to describe their experiences, to describe what was going on, to describe what was wrong fundamentally with their education, which is why we made it into a manifesto. But crucially, we attempted to make the manifesto easy to understand. It doesn't reference many texts or anything like that. It's not wound up in academic jargon, because also that is a barrier to entry for many people. It was in a simplistic way as possible, so we could ensure that people could engage and people could get on board. I agree. The issue of not being able to, if you don't make efforts to decolonize, then university won't be attractive. I think that that's something that now people are starting to understand. I think a year ago, it was very much seen that, no, we just need an outreach program. And there was definitely a debate had, not just myself, but a number of other students of color, about how the ethics of being people of color advertising a place that you knew wasn't safe, or you knew wouldn't be happy. You could be happy at Durham as a student of color, of course you could be, but the ethics of advertising that, I think, were very difficult. And so trying to explain that in a way to people with power in the university, I think, was quite difficult and posed a lot of questions, because obviously a lot of these boards that we sat on, a lot of the spaces we were in, for example, I would frequently be the only person that wasn't white in a room talking about decolonization, talking about how the process should go forward in terms of developing the university strategy on it. Namely, I remember distinctly arguing against getting a decolonization task and finish group, because I was just this university is not going to decolonize through a task and finish group. It's not you're not going to just do progress reports throughout the year and then it'll be done. Like, we still don't know fully what a decolonized university looks like. You can't put that on a task and finish group. It needs to be thorough, genuine cooperation between staff and students, particularly between staff and students of colour. And getting them to understand that, I think, took a while. Getting them to understand that it wasn't just something that they could put in a nice little subgroup of just like the RAC or something like that, and it would be sorted out. It's just an issue of putting a few more people of colour on the reading list, and then it would all be fine. I think that was very much the perception for a period of time, but we really wanted to safeguard against that. So then, in addition to like the what and the how, in the manifesto, we had 6 key principles that we thought were really important, but also made it very clear that this task was not just about diversifying the curriculum or anything like that. It is a holistic task. So we had the 6 principles were on what education should look like at the university, past activity and complicity in colonialism, the treatment of international students, climate justice, unpaid labour, and the hierarchy embedded in university structures. In terms of, like, I think the education one was generally the one that a lot of people would have as like a gateway in, which was quite useful. So as I was saying before, like giving students the tools to describe their experiences, being like, yeah, it is quite bad that your curriculum looks like that, is that your curriculum is like, even something simple like as your curriculum is boring. Have you noticed how these other things also can be true? And I think that generally works quite well for getting students on board. So when talking about things like the treatment of international students, or talking about like the university's history, you tend, if you're using education as a way for them to get into that and start to unpick some of the problems that were there. So we ended up taking the full manifesto to the university executive committee. Could you give us the 6 principles again, a bit slower? Yeah, sorry, I'm a fast talker. So the principles were education and what it should look like. So that was all about how education should be truly global, and weave critical race theory and throughout, and acknowledge holistically the impacts of disciplines, and treat them. And oh, have you found the manifesto? Yeah, that's the manifesto. So there was that, and then there was past activity and colonial activity, past complicity in colonial activity. So that was about the Durham acknowledging the way it had previously engaged and endorsed colonial practices, and how its history had been wound up in those issues. So some fun facts learned about Durham during this time, where Durham used to be, up until about the 1990s or something like that, Durham was linked to a college in Barbados that was built on a slave plantation with a slaver's money, and like just acknowledging that was something that was quite like shocking but useful to know. And also there were other examples of previous vice chancellors and previous chancellors engaging in some quite in colonial and imperialist activity, and some more interesting links between universities. And I think that it was also important to put that in because, as I said before, I think it hadn't been discussed. One of the funniest conversations I had throughout the year was when, in an entirely separate conversation about education and like transnational education, it was brought up that Durham has previously had engaged in transnational education, and it gave the example of when it used to be twinned with Barbados, the college on the slave plantation in Barbados. And I was like, I don't know if we should be listing that as something we were proud that we were engaged with. And someone turned around to me and was like, do you mean to say that has colonial links? And I was like, yeah, I think that does have some colonial implications, as well as just generally not being a good thing. So getting them at least to recognize that there was some issues was important. Then there was one of the international students, because I think this is generally true of the sector as a whole at the moment, but Durham in particular is around a third international students, and combined with national policy against international students, but also the way generally international students are treated like cash cows by the university, we felt it was important to acknowledge that and to have some kind of recognition of that, and hopefully get the university to recognise that something was not okay there. Then we had climate justice, which was about acknowledging the neo-colonial dynamics of climate justice and the ways that the university could alleviate them, and the ways that the university needs to take them into account when participating in any form of climate justice work, which was quite interesting and quite I think another one of the things that it was useful to get students on board with, because students generally, in terms of the students that were looking to engage with this work at Durham, I think a fair few of them did care about climate justice, and getting them to think about it that way. It also served as like a part of an education piece to explain to students how colonial dynamics directly are impacting like climate justice, and how those two things can't be separated. So getting the university, so saying that the university should have that principle when it investigates what work it does on climate justice, who it collaborates with, who it funds. Who it funds is a really important one, because obviously Durham, like a lot of universities, has claims to has an ethical investment policy, but still has still their main bank provider is Barclays. They still have shares in Amazon, etc. So obviously the claim to being environmentally friendly when you are still de facto investing in fossil fuels and general exploitation is interesting. Then we also had a point, and this is one of the points that I thought was really important throughout the year, based on a lot of conversations that I had on the unpaid labour of students. So I think it's true at a lot of universities, but definitely was at Durham, that a lot of the work that had been done was done by unpaid students of colour or unpaid staff of colour, and they were not forced to, but there was the attitude that if you wanted to do something, do it yourself. And so you had to do an inordinate amount of extra work, and that should have been paid by the university, because otherwise you just end up replicating those inequalities. And that's something that I think going forward was really well accepted. It was actually quite interesting seeing the disconnect when presenting the paper to smaller working groups that had staff on them that were of slightly a lower level versus university executives. When spoken to staff at a lower level, and I think it was like a race equality charter, a teaching and learning group, we were talking about the unpaid labour, and they were and there was a lot of discussion about how important it was that we actually did discuss that, because I think that sometimes we just are like, student and staff cooperation, that's a great thing, but if like a student is having to put in like considerably extra hours just to make sure that like their course isn't like, that course is engaging, or not just engaging but like fundamentally not discriminating against them, then there's something wrong. Like they should be being paid for that. And it was interesting to hear when talking to people from like various departments how they thought it was important just in terms of student engagement in whenever they had attempted to do decolonize initiatives. So like various departments had said that it was like one of their priorities for the year was like going to be decolonizing, but a lot of them had hit sort of dead ends because they found it really difficult to get retention from students and staff of colour, because there just simply weren't enough hours in the day, but also there weren't really incentives to engage in that work. And obviously students and staff of colour in an institution that is quite structurally like it is just structurally racist, don't have the time or the emotional energy to expend on that. And so putting that forward, I think, was really important in terms of one of the foundational principles being that we don't think that this work should be unpaid. But it was also important in terms of seeing how individuals from departments that had been doing this work recognised it and saw it as important, was really encouraging, I think, and gave a really strong backing when it was taken higher up. So we could be like, we've spoken to departments, we know that this is important, rather than it just being dismissed as something that like would be nice to do maybe later. So that was really good. And then the last principle was on the hierarchy in the university, because often in the university there was not much representation of people of colour in any of the structures. So in Senate or in council, there aren't particularly many people of colour. The university executive committee didn't have any people of colour on it, and like their subgroups, the only reason that one of the subgroups had a person of colour on it was because I sat on it, and that was through virtue of being elected. So acknowledging that it should not be the case that those conversations are able to happen in rooms where like people of colour like literally just aren't even invited in, and there's no democratic representative for those groups. I think that another thing that universities have done over the past like few months has been like a lot of democracy via open letter, and that has meant circumventing the elected representatives of certain groups, and that was definitely the case in Durham. So students that were like the president of the People of Colour Association, for example, would on occasion be circumvented in favour of a different student leader that just really cared about the issue but wouldn't be consulted. And that meant that there was a picking and choosing of which people of colour were listened to within the university. And acknowledging that was the case was very difficult, and I think something that still hasn't entirely happened. So we basically took those principles to the university executive committee in, I think, June or July now, and they agreed with that's fine, no worries. And they agreed with all of the principles besides the principle on the exploitation of international students being bad, because they couldn't say that their practices were exploitative. But I think that it was interesting, not just the journey that was gone throughout the year, but also seeing the journey that some of the university executives have been throughout the year. So there were genuinely people at the start of the year that had said that, like the same people that had said to me that decolonisation is just like a matter of, it's just another name for diversity. Having them then at the end of the year seem to get it and seem to be like, no, it is really important that we make sure that this work is led and is a genuine cooperation between staff and students of colour, and we're making sure that these voices are ingrained. It was really, I think, the way that we structured it, and the way that throughout the year, and the way that the manifesto, I think, in part was laid out, was to ensure that it was easy to understand, but also, sadly, I think, because of Black Lives Matter, I think it did get to a point where the university couldn't then shy away from it any longer. They couldn't hide it behind something else and say, oh, we'll deal with that later. We've currently got all these things to do. I think it really brought it to the forefront of the university's minds, but also it became paramount because a significant amount of stories about racism in Durham came out in national press, but also quite a few on like a general local incidents level. And I think that definitely forced their hands, which is very bleak. It is very bleak that it took that for members of the university to actually sit up and listen and be like, we actually do need to give this time. But I think that they probably would have gotten there eventually. I just think it probably would have actually taken at least another 6 months, because it wasn't a priority. And I think that was part of the issue, was that it wasn't the priority. So what we basically found to be really effective was making sure that we had those clear principles, those clear guiding principles. That now means that the work that is being done this year and the work that we'll be doing next year, because they're not prescriptive, they're not like a list of demands, it is a list of guiding principles that generally believed to be true and important. That means that work can now be sustainable, and also in part because it is now explicitly ran through the students' union. Yeah, so it was because it was ran through the students' union. That also means that it has a level of staying power, at least, because obviously there are students' union staff, and that longevity is there in a way in which I think occasionally, if it's just sporadic student groups, that wasn't really possible. And it meant that there were lots of students that previously hadn't spoken about decolonisation, that now did. But of course, that also came with the problem of people who students that didn't, particularly white students that didn't understand decolonisation, again co-opting that work for their own ends. And a part of that was just being vigilant against when that happened and being like, no, that's actually not what we mean. We don't just mean generic good thing happening to the curriculum. There were cases of people saying we need to move past just talking about decolonisation of race. We need to talk about increasing the amount of women on our reading list, which is true, but they didn't mean in terms of increasing the amount of women of colour that were being taught. It was very much we've now done race, we'll do the other things now. And I think that seems to be the ongoing problem of decolonising work, is making sure that co-option is safeguarded against. And that was something that was really important. And I think we did a good job, but we tried. Yeah. So that's my that was my journey. If you have any questions, hit me up. I mean, we're still here. We've got 25 minutes. But yeah, if you have any questions about decolonising stuff and how it worked, especially somewhere like Durham, there's a Q&A thing, or you can just put it in the chat. That's fine, so everyone can see. Oh, and there is. Okay. I'm interested by how. I don't necessarily. I think interestingly, the issues that were faced in terms of specific to doing decolonising work in the North was actually just about the ability to get people. Like, I think that so in terms of like student activism, a lot of stuff had happened in like more London-based universities. So, for example, like Goldsmiths, like those really great Goldsmiths anti-racism action, and other places like that. I think getting that sharing of knowledge was actually probably one of the most difficult things, in terms of like the actual geographical problems. I think also there were that I think the rhetoric of there aren't as many people of color in the North was definitely a thing, not just from the university. There were a fair few students who attempted to use that to say that the work that we were doing was irrelevant. But besides that, I don't think there was anything too specific. I think in part the specific difficulties were based on that rhetoric. And I think, to be honest, that rhetoric would have happened like regardless of where in the country we were. But the way in particular I think Durham was able to use that to murky the waters was very uncomfortable and caused, I think, a lot, like it made the conversation a little bit more difficult at the time. But yeah, I don't know. I think, and their manpower as well. I think that was that they tended to be the specific difficulties that in the North. Cool. The specifics about steps taken in various departments and university-wide. So in terms of like in departments, so a lot of departments had like specific groups that like pre-existed all of this, and that was part of why. So we called it Durham Decolonised Network because, in part because of we wanted it to be a network of those groups. We wanted that to be like some kind of linking up. So in various departments, so I think in one department, in the sociology department, they actually have somebody that like is undertaking like a substantial review of their curriculum, specifically with the decolonising in mind. So there's that, and then in other departments, it was more like working group stages of figuring out what was happening, it seemed. So some departments were thinking about doing things like poster campaigns and stuff like to educate students, but it wasn't as in depth. So I think now the model that was provided by the network that had yet to pass when I left was for each faculty. So in Durham there are 4 faculties. There's the business school, science, social sciences and health, and arts and humanities. And for each faculty to employ 3 student interns to work within their department, reviewing the curriculum and suggesting changes that could be made. It's a similar practice to, I think Huddersfield have curriculum consultants as well. So in a similar way to that. And then in terms of university-wide, like the commitment to decolonising, I think is the specific main step. And they are now, they have like the race equality charter. They're going through that as well. So I think this is like intertwined with that. So that in terms of like substantial steps, that's sort of as far as they got. But I think that the next steps were going to be making that work happen in departments to go forward. What would my advice be for an SU that may not have a Sab of colour every year? So I'd say, obviously there is the issue of listening, which I think that sometimes white sabs, sometimes they're very good at this, sometimes they're not particularly good at this. It's a skill. Reaching out in terms of in places where SUs don't tend to have sabs of colour or don't have high representation of students of colour, reaching out to like relevant groups. So like whether your SU has like a People of Colour Association or a BME campaign or anything like that, or like an Afro-Caribbean society or like cultural societies, trying to engage them and find students of colour, like representative students of colour, where they can be met and finding out their priorities. And then sometimes it's a matter of doing like the legwork. So obviously there is the issue of like being comfortable boosting and amplifying voices, which is really, really important, but also ensuring finding that balance between making sure that you are working with them, but also making sure that student representatives aren't having to take on yeah, that's a good point. It's useful to know what a SAB is. Making sure that they aren't, as a result, taking on additional unpaid labour or unpaid emotional labour in particular. So trying to find out ways that they think you can support them, whether it be doing some legwork for them, like literally, even if it's just like researching something or taking the time to like write up notes for a campaign or something like that. I think that can be quite useful. And also, if you are in a meeting where something like the treatment of students of colour is on the agenda for whatever reason, whether it's like decolonised work or just general issues with racism in the university, it sounds like the bare minimum, but if you get that with enough advance notice, making sure that you can actually bring students of colour along to that meeting, and to some extent like insisting on it, being like, no, like we literally should not be having this conversation if everybody in this room is white. And I think that that's probably something that a lot of people would be better for doing, just be like, no, this conversation literally shouldn't be happening. As it like, and if it does go on and happen, be like, making it clear that like you're not happy with that, I think is also important. Yeah, so finding that space is difficult to find, but I think useful. Do you have any top tips on surviving being the only sab of colour in the SU? Make friends, like nationally. I was very lucky in that I knew a few other sabs of colour nationally that if I was irritated being the only sab of colour, because also team dynamics, I think often means that if you're the only sab of colour, there is a danger that you, instead of being whatever your portfolio is, you become the racism officer. So if ever racism happens, you're the officer that deals with the racism. So making sure that you have a solid network of people around you, of people of colour in particular around you. And also if there are people of colour, like, again, making sure that you're still involved in those groups, like people of colour campaigns at your university, I think is good in terms of grounding. I think also just find it, oh, my light is fading fast. Also just finding that out, where what it is you will tolerate and what it is you won't tolerate, which was some of both the peakest and best piece of advice I was given as a SAB, was there will always be, and this is really peak and shitty that this is true, but there will always be white men that treat you poorly because you are a person of colour or a woman. That's not okay. But if you want to get things done, and this is so awful, figuring out what it is you will not tolerate. So for me, it was having white people talk down to me about racism, or having I would tolerate, say for example, a fellow SPASC officer asking me questions about race in a way that was not necessarily the most comfortable thing in the world, but I would tolerate it. What I would draw the line at would be if she if they um if they doubted me or undermined me or said anything publicly that undermined me, which is again really unfair, because it is not fair that SABs of colour have to take on this additional labour and have to have such a low bar for their fellow SPASC officers or members of university staff. But figuring out early on what your threshold is and what you're willing to fight on and what you won't, which is really sad, but true. I'm going to turn my light on before I fade into a mood. There we go. That's better. I look more alive now. That and have good networks. Good networks are important. And also talking to staff members as well. Finding staff members that you can rely on, and know that there are people that you can rant to is generally a good way of doing it. How to encourage students from ethnic minority groups to get involved in those events and campaigns. I think in part it's a matter of talking to them from the beginning about it. So if there is an event like Decolonise Work, like making sure that they are being spoken to before, like in the planning stages, before like it's a done deal, to make sure that they're actually like involved, but also meet them where they are, talk to whether it be like particular groups that you know have like high amount of like students of colour involved with them, and like co-create with them. So it's an issue of like listening as well, and also making sure that those events and campaigns are safe, which is again a bit bleak, but I think sometimes activist spaces or and any form of space actually where you're talking about oppression, there is always the danger that somebody will say something that is not great, or at times overtly racist, and making sure that there are clear ways for those things to not happen, because I think that that's often an issue, is that sometimes those events will happen and people will go and either be disruptive or be ignorant, and finding ways to protect students of colour during those times is quite difficult. So having clear ground rules, I think, is also important, and making sure that they know that that's an important thing to do. Protecting my own well-being as a SAB of colour and often being involved in activism is very much having a strong network. Also having good allies as well. The SU president the year that I was a SAB was absolutely incredible, and would always be ready to fight my corners if I needed to, which is useful, as well as like make sure that you know other SABs of colour, and also take days off. It is fine. I think that often, especially if you're like the only SAB of colour, or it's a rarity for there to be a SAB of colour, you really feel that time pressure, and you're like, oh, I've got to do so much so quickly. But also making sure that you are logging out of your sabbatical Facebook account on the weekends and in the evenings and doing normal people things. Like obviously there will be like activism things that you need to do in the evening, and often sometimes your friends will be the people that you do activism with, but sometimes having to have hard boundaries and be like, I do not want to talk about this right now. If you want to talk to me about this, you can talk to me about it between the hours of 9 and 5. Otherwise, can we do something else, please? Let's watch Made in Chelsea. I don't know. Do literally anything else. And I think that that's important having other things to do, as well as having a solid network of both white allies, but people of colour. In terms of advice for staff being involved in this work, I think reaching out to student representatives is a really important one, whether it be course reps or your SU, finding out if there are things going on there. I think going through courses is a long and difficult task, but part of it is just going through and looking and being critical of what is taught, and being like a critical friend to colleagues and others of when figuring out what's appropriate and what is continued to be taught. Because I think that sometimes it was definitely the case at Durham that some things continued to be taught just because like the person that taught them seemed like what like the faculty liked them, and so being able to have those challenging conversations I think is really important, as well as making sure that students are being brought in and staff of colour as well are being brought in. So whether there's like a BAME network or like a staff BAME network, I'd say is really important for being involved in this work, and also taking care of yourself, which is I think something that generally during these times people aren't good at, but staff already have a lot of workload on, and so making sure that you are not spending, that the workload is divided in a healthy manner, and that the spaces being used is like effective. I think in terms of standing up for SABs of colour, I think asking for their boundaries is more effective than asking for their boundaries is effective. And sometimes if it's something like somebody is being spoken over them, but I wouldn't raise it as an issue if you feel like something is going wrong or someone is treating them in a specific way. If it seems like they like finding out what they're comfortable with, because every SAB or every person of colour is different, right? Like if I was spoken over in meetings, I was generally fine, but occasionally my counterpart, so I was an undergraduate academic officer, my postgraduate academic officer was a white man, and he would occasionally be like, I think Sam was saying something just then, or would like back me up on things, but he knew that I was comfortable with that, like we had discussed it. So discussing where they're comfortable with and how they want those situations to be navigated, because it is also the case that sometimes you don't want to have, like, you just don't want to have that battle that day or like ever, and you have other ways of dealing with it. So finding out their boundaries, I think, is the most important thing, because sometimes also you can stand up for a fellow SAB, but undermine them if you don't exactly get it, what they're like. There were a fair few instances I had last year where like even the work that I was doing on decolonize, like other white SABs who I respect a great deal, but would try and back me up, but because they didn't quite get the point I was making, or sometimes I actually just didn't need backing up, I was just fine as was, that became undermining. So there's a fine line between undermining and like platforming. So I think that, there's not a fine line, but there is definitely a boundary there, and finding out where they feel that boundary is, and whether it be just like talking to them, talking about like what they feel is they're comfortable with, I think is just the most important thing. Generally, finding out what people's boundaries are is really useful, especially if they are a SAB from any minority group. Finding out what their boundaries are is like one of the most important things. Yeah, Cool, no problem. Well, we have 3 minutes left. So unless anyone has any more questions, I also have an email that you can email if you have anything that you want to run through with me. I will send it in the chat. Cool. I hope this was helpful. I've not been a SAB for, I don't know, 4 months now. So it's nice to talk about the things that I did that were good, that weren't traumatizing. But yeah, this has been a nice, fun stream of consciousness. But yeah, I hope it has been helpful. Oh, I've just sent it to panelists. That's not what I wanted to do. There we go. Tom already knows my email. He doesn't need that again.
Yeah, I really don't.
Yeah, you're fine. Yeah, that's me.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sam. Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there, and I think it's going to take me a little while to to really process everything that has come out of this session. But yeah, this has been really, really useful. If you are sitting in the audience and you don't already know, I just need to really quickly plug that we have a Discord to go along with the conference where we can share resources and talk about the content. There is a link to the manifesto if you didn't catch the link before in there, alongside some of the resources from the other sessions as well. But yeah, Sam, thank you so much for coming along. I just realized I didn't say where the Discord link was. It's in the email where you got all these Zoom links. At the bottom of that email, there is also a link to the Discord. Yes, Sam, thank you so much. It's really, really useful and insightful little rump through your time as an officer.
Yeah, little whistle stop tour on my year as a SAB. And I didn't even mention COVID once. Genuinely, what an outstanding job.
Oh wow, yeah.
Yeah.
That's a big omission as well. Nice one.
Besides, during Durham, during my SAB year, there was a vote of no confidence attempt against the president, a major wrong campaign during our SU elections, and COVID. So I, like, of the three things, COVID is just like the smaller one. I'm just like, yeah, that happened, I guess. Good times.
Good. Right. Yes. So this is the last of our sessions that are in what you could reasonably call the working day. There is an evening panel called Grasping at the Roots that the NUS have organised, which is at 6 o'clock. Again, the link should already have been circulated, but I'll put it in the Discord as well if you've lost your emails. But yeah, Sam, thank you so much. And I think that is everything. Right, cheers for coming along, guys. And I think I'm gonna, I need to finish this recording.